Joining me now is Natalie Jackson, one of the attorneys for the Martin family. Natalie, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, Piers.
The general feeling seems to be it was a good day for the defence because the police effectively corroborated much of what George Zimmerman had told them and basically said they agreed with him. But there is another view that there were certain parts of what came out today which were very helpful to the prosecution. And I want you just to highlight those for me if you can.
There were. First, I'd like to put the statement that it was a good day for the defense into perspective. The defense, Detective Serino was asked at each point that he interviewed George Zimmerman, did he change his story? He wasn't asked when he looked at all his interviews together. He said that he did not have a chance to do that until later. So let's talk about some of the inconsistencies. One of the inconsistencies is that George Zimmerman said Trayvon circled his car after going through the walkway. Circled his car completely. He said that Trayvon, as he got out of his car to look for an address, not to follow Trayvon, but to look for an address to give dispatch, that Trayvon jumped out of a bush and sucker punched him. Then he said that Trayvon asked him, in another interview, he said Trayvon asked him, "You got a problem?" He said, "No, man, I don't have a problem." As he was looking down to get his phone out of his pocket or reaching into his pocket, he said Trayvon hit him. Then he said that when Trayvon was on top of him, he said, "You're going to die tonight, MF." Then he said when Trayvon shot him, Trayvon said, "You got me," and continued to talk as he proceeded to climb on Trayvon's back to check him to see if he had any weapons. So those were the things that I thought stood out to the jury. One of the things that Detective Serino said that was very interesting to the jury because I was watching them, he said that the injuries that George Zimmerman suffered were very minor and they were not consistent with being hit 20 to 30 times.
There also is no apparent evidence, and none that's emerged so far, that there was any of George Zimmerman's DNA on Trayvon's fists or that Trayvon's fists were bruised in any way, which is sort of what you'd expect if he had indeed punched him in the face.
Exactly, exactly. And that was one of the things that I think when you saw the third interview, this was after they've done the walkthrough and after they've talked to George Zimmerman briefly the first night, you start to see them really questioning his story. Doris Singleton, she pointed out that she didn't see the bush that Trayvon could have jumped out of, and she said Trayvon was a tall and skinny kid. So where was he hiding? They questioned him about being hit. They questioned him about, not saying when confronted by Trayvon, according to him, he said, Trayvon said, "What are you following me for?" And he said nothing and reached into his pocket. They questioned, why didn't you just say, "I'm neighborhood watch"? And he said that It wasn't his job.
Yeah, it's all very confusing. Another thing I found confusing listening to it this morning was why he didn't know the street names when there are only 3 street names in that particular area. He knows that area. Why would he feign total lack of knowledge when there's just 3 street names?
Well, I think that's very telling because the biggest I think, piece of evidence against George Zimmerman is his own words to the non-emergency officer, where he said that Trayvon, he goes, "OS, he's running," and he gets out of his car. The dispatch asked him, "Are you following him?" He said, "Yes," and he said, "We don't need you to do that." He says, "Okay." Well, he told Detective Singleton and Detective Serino that he got out of his car to look for an address. That's very inconsistent, and that's very self-serving. And I think that goes to who confronted, who was the aggressor.
Having said all this, a final question, Natalie, and briefly, if you may. Having said all this, the problem you have, surely, as the prosecutors here, is that the key witness, the one person that can really answer these questions, is dead, and that's Trayvon. Under Florida law, if you were just listening to those police testimonies today, you would say that the law of probability now is that they will probably succeed in defending George Zimmerman under the way Florida law works, unless some new evidence comes to light.
I would refer you back to Rachel Gentile, who said she was on the phone when she heard it. She said she heard George Zimmerman approach Trayvon, and she said she heard Trayvon say, "Get off." I believe that's why the prosecution put her on. And if you question her inconsistencies, which she had a few inconsistent wording. So did George Zimmerman. So did John Good. So did all of these witnesses. This is a year and a half later. So I think the jury will take all of this into consideration.
Natalie Jackson, always good to talk to you. We'll have Rachel Gentel's lawyer coming later in the show. Good to talk to you for now, though. Now I want to bring in Alex Ferrer. He's a former Florida Circuit Court judge and also the host of television's Judge Alex. Alex Ferrer, a fascinating day, mainly because, as I said earlier, you heard everything from George Zimmerman's mouth, and it was pretty contemporaneous, recorded on the evening of this attack. What did you make of it in totality?
Well, in totality, Piers, you know, I was on your show just the other day, and I was telling you how it looked like every day the state was giving information that was beneficial to the defense through their very own witnesses. Today is absolutely no difference. With no disrespect to Ms. Jackson, I know she has her viewpoint on it, but I'm looking at it from the standpoint of a judge. The elements of the crime that have to be proven by the state, it seems like every day in this trial, the state calls witnesses, they get a point from the witness, and the defense gets a point or two from the witness. It's like the movie Groundhog's Day. We relive it every single day. Today was no different. They called the homicide detectives and the other officer who testified today to testify about the interviews and the interrogation of George Zimmerman. There are inconsistencies in there. There are minimal inconsistencies when you're looking at him from the standpoint of the elements that have to be proven. Did he jump out of the bushes or did he come out of the darkness? Did he circle the car completely or not circle the car completely? What the prosecution has to prove is that he acted out of ill will, hatred, spite, or an evil intent in order to get second-degree murder. The question has been asked to many witnesses, Piers, including the two police officers today, both of whom said they saw no evidence, no trace of ill will, hatred, or spite whatsoever. In fact, they threw another bone into the defense's tent here because the homicide detective said, when I learned that he was mentoring African-American children, I realized it had nothing to do with profiling. I don't know how it could get much worse for the prosecution, to be honest with you.
Yeah, pretty tough. And the things that I picked up on, which I felt would be useful to the defence, may be completely irrelevant. You know, the fact that he got out of the vehicle, the fact that he should have known the streets because there are only 3 streets, all that kind of stuff really, if I take what you told me the other night, it is really immaterial, because what matters is when they actually got fighting, did George Zimmerman genuinely fear for his life? And if he did, under Florida law, then he can claim self-defense.
You are 100% right. You know, should he know the street names? Yes. The reason he didn't know the street names, I believe, just between you and me and the millions who watch you, because he got out of the car to see where Trayvon Martin went, not to look at a street sign. But under Florida law, that makes no difference. That does not constitute stalking under Florida law. It is not illegal. You can follow anybody you want. You can walk up to a stranger in your neighborhood and say, "What are you doing here?" The guy can can tell you to go take a jump off a pier, but it's not illegal. So the parts that really, the thing the jury's going to focus on is, did he have to shoot? In his mind, was it reasonable for him to believe that he was facing death or serious bodily injury? If they believe that it was reasonable, regardless of what the seriousness of his injuries are, because he doesn't have an x-ray machine with him to tell him if his nose is broken or not, if they believe that under those circumstances it was reasonable to fear serious bodily injury, they are going to find him not guilty because of self-defense.
Let's play a clip. This is from the cross-examination by Mark O'Meara of Chris Serino, the detective. Let's see what he had to say.
The fact that George Zimmerman said to you, "Thank God, I hope somebody did videotape the event or the whole event," his statement, what did that indicate to you?
Either he was telling the truth or he was a complete pathological liar.
You think he was telling the truth?
Yes.
And let me ask you, Alex, for your reaction to that, but also the question I asked Natalie Jackson, which is it naive of me to assume that the police would say this kind of thing primarily because of all the criticism they got after the fact they didn't charge Zimmerman on the night? In other words, this is really corroborating their own positions.
It's obviously not the least bit naive. That's a perfect question to ask. And yes, you can always say the officers in this case were motivated to make it look like they were making the right decision when they decided not to charge. The problem is, if that's what it is, if it's a cover-up, a massive cover-up, they had all this evidence to present that showed second-degree murder and they didn't present it, then where is that evidence? The prosecution can't. If the prosecution can't produce it, it just doesn't exist. And that clip you just played is crucial. Here you have the homicide detective saying He did what I've done to people before. I used to be a police officer, and you get somebody there and you think they're lying to you, you make up evidence. Your co-defendant just confessed and told us he put it all on you. You make up evidence to see if they crack. He made up evidence and said, we think we're going to have video of what happened here with all the phones that were here. And what did Zimmerman say? Thank God. I was praying that somebody was videotaping what happened to me. You know, and then he finishes it by saying, and I believed he was telling the truth. I mean, I really don't imagine how it could have gotten worse for the state. Now, there is one thing, though, Piers.
Very tough. Yes.
There is one more thing. Remember, they're charged with second-degree murder, but the jury will be instructed on manslaughter. It is possible that the prosecution always, and they're not supposed to do this, intended to shoot high with the hopes that the jury will settle for manslaughter. They're not supposed to do that. But if that happens, if the jury convicts of manslaughter, Zimmerman's as done as if he would have been for second-degree murder, because for manslaughter of a child or with a firearm, it's 30 years in prison maximum.
All right, fascinating. Judge Alex, thank you very much indeed.